My family treated me like a parasite, until they found out I owned the company where my spoiled sister got hired. Most families have that one ritual that looks normal from the outside but slowly eats you alive from the inside. And for mine, it was the weekly dinner where my parents basically turned my life into a comparison chart. By the time I hit middle school, I could tell what kind of night it was going to be, just by the way my father stacked the plates and the way my mother hovered around the oven with that tight little smile that meant she was about to perform. My older sister would sit at the end of the table closest to the kitchen, which somehow became the unofficial spotlight seat, and my parents would line up her certificates and trophies like props in a play no one else had agreed to be in. They would read every achievement out loud, pausing for reactions, while I focused on cutting my food into smaller and smaller pieces and pretending my chest wasn't burning. On the surface, it probably looked kind of wholesome, proud parents bragging about their kid, but there was always this second part of the performance where the spotlight swung straight at me. It usually started when my mother tilted her head, sighed dramatically, and asked why I couldn't be more like my sister, as if I had accidentally ordered the wrong personality from a catalog and we were still within the return window. The worst night was when I tried to mention a little project I was working on, some code I had been writing on an old desktop in the basement, and my sister actually laughed out loud. She rolled her eyes and said playing with computers didn't count as a real accomplishment, and my parents laughed with her the way people laugh at a joke they don't even understand but feel obligated to support. My father had two main modes when it came to me: explosive and invisible. If I pushed back even a little, like saying I was proud of something small I had done at school, he would slam his hand on the table or shove his chair back so hard it squealed, then yell about disrespect and how he was not going to be spoken to like that in his own house. If I stayed quiet and stared at my plate, he would ignore me for days afterward, walking past me in the hallway like I was a coat rack that happened to breathe. My mother's specialty was the long, disappointed sigh, the one that said more than any insult could, followed by her favorite question: "Why can't you be more like your sister?" After a while, I stopped even trying to answer. Because it wasn't really a question, it was just their way of reminding me I was the wrong daughter. The only place that felt remotely safe was the basement. It wasn't some cute, finished basement with a couch and a big screen. It was cold concrete, exposed pipes, old boxes, and a beat-up desk in the corner with a creaky office chair that I found on the curb one afternoon. They had shoved an ancient computer down there years before when they upgraded the one in the living room, and that thing became my entire world. I would sit there for hours teaching myself how to code from random tutorials and forums, typing and deleting and trying again until the logic finally clicked. It sounds dramatic, but that basement was the only space in the house where I wasn't being measured against my sister's latest accomplishment, where no one was sighing at me or asking why I wasn't more impressive. By college age, I rarely went upstairs except to sleep. Everyone assumed I would follow the script: go to a good school, get a respectable degree, and turn into some polished adult my mother could brag about at every gathering. For a minute, I even tried to play along. I enrolled in a computer science program because it felt like the closest thing to that basement version of me, but sitting in those huge lecture halls listening to professors talk in circles made me feel like I was slowly drowning. I kept thinking about building something real instead of writing code for grades and fighting to impress people who had never met me before and would forget me right after finals. So one Sunday dinner when I was 19, I did the thing that basically detonated whatever was left of my childhood. I waited until my father had finished reading my sister's latest list of achievements, and my mother had made her usual speech about being so blessed. And then I told them I was dropping out of college to start a software company with two people I had met through an online forum. I probably should have led with a softer intro, but subtle has never really been my talent. My father went from calm to volcanic in about 3 seconds. He slammed his fist on the table so hard a glass tipped over and shattered on the floor. And then he started yelling about how I was throwing my life away, how only irresponsible people quit college, how no one under his roof was going to act like a lazy failure on his dime. My mother started crying like I had announced I was joining some cult in the desert. She kept saying she did not raise a daughter to become some dropout embarrassment, asking over and over if I had any idea what people would say. My sister just leaned against the doorway with this satisfied little smile, watching the scene like she was at a show she had already seen, but still loved. She muttered something about how, of course, this was happening, because I never could finish anything I started. And that almost hurt more than my father's yelling, because she sounded genuinely delighted. After the screaming part, my father switched into his other weapon of choice: silence. For days he moved through the house without looking at me, without saying my name, like I was air he was forced to breathe but didn't want to acknowledge. He knocked on the basement door only once, to tell me if I wanted to act grown and make my own decisions, I could figure out my life without their help. I stayed, technically, because I had nowhere else to go and no money yet, but it felt less like living there and more like being tolerated as some distant relative they couldn't quite legally throw out. I threw myself into work instead. The little company we were trying to build was basically 3 people, 2 folding tables, a couple of secondhand monitors, and a lot of caffeine. We rented this tiny room in a shared office building that smelled weirdly like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner, and I loved it. I worked absurd hours, sometimes staying until morning, sleeping on a cheap mattress we shoved into a corner. I would drag myself back to the house every few days to shower, grab clean clothes, and pretend the basement was still mine, even though I could feel my mother's eyes on me every time I came up the stairs. I heard her on the phone more than once telling someone she did not know how much longer she could tolerate my phase. It stayed like that for years, while my parents kept telling anyone who would listen that their younger daughter had wasted her potential and was playing startup in some silly little office. I was slowly building something that actually worked. We landed one tiny client, then another slightly bigger one, and then a local business that made my hands shake when I signed the contract. There were months when I didn't pay myself at all so we could afford another developer or a better server, and I ate the same sad microwave meals on repeat until my stomach hurt. But every time a piece of code worked, or a client renewed a contract, it felt like another brick in this thing that belonged to me, not to their version of who I should be. 5 years after that first dinner meltdown, things looked completely different on paper, even if my parents still had no idea. The company had grown to around 40 employees spread across a couple of floors in a slightly nicer building, and we were working with clients that actually showed up in regional news. A local business magazine did a feature on young founders in tech, and they put my picture next to a quote I barely remembered saying because I had been running on about 3 hours of sleep. I bought a small apartment in a not fancy but decent part of the city, with creaky wooden floors and a view of a parking lot that somehow felt like freedom every time I looked at it. I didn't tell my parents about any of it. On official documents, I still used their address because changing everything felt like inviting questions I didn't want to answer. I kept a suitcase with old clothes and an ancient laptop in the basement on purpose, because I knew my mother still went down there sometimes to poke around. I left just enough there to keep the illusion alive for her. So I let her keep the illusion, even as I spent most nights falling asleep on my own couch with my laptop balanced on my stomach and empty takeout containers on the coffee table. Every once in a while, I would show up for a Sunday dinner just to keep the peace on the surface. They would ask me how the job hunt was going, because in their version of events, I was still bouncing between part-time gigs and wasting time. If I tried to talk about a project or something the company had accomplished, my father would cut me off with some condescending comment about how I needed to stop dreaming and get serious, and my mother would pivot straight back to my sister's academic progress. She had gone on to grad school, of course, and every new degree or research opportunity became another jewel in her crown during those meals. And look, I wish I could say I did not care, that I sat there like some evolved adult who had outgrown all of it, but that would be a lie. I cared way more than I wanted to. My stomach still knotted up the second the comparison started, and no amount of real-life responsibility could stop me from feeling like the quiet kid at the end of the table again. In the actual world, I was signing contracts and making payroll and dealing with clients who trusted me with serious decisions. In that dining room, I was still the daughter who had allegedly never lived up to her potential. I did not tell them about the company or the apartment because I was above their opinion. I stayed quiet because I knew exactly what they would do with the information. They would either shrug it off as luck or twist it into some story about me thinking I was better than them now. I did not have the energy for that. It was easier to let them keep their little narrative about me bouncing between odd jobs than to watch them drag my actual work through the mud. The night everything really flipped started the way a lot of our family disasters did, with one of my mother's group texts. She sent a message saying we were doing a special family dinner that Sunday because my sister had big news. I almost ignored it. Those dinners always took me days to recover from. But curiosity is evil, and I let it win. When I walked into the house, it looked like we were hosting some kind of ceremony. Extra dishes, candles, the good tablecloth. My mother was practically vibrating. My sister waited until everyone was seated, then came in wearing a blazer that screamed, "I am about to make an announcement." She held a folder like it was an award and took her time opening it. Then she said she had accepted a position at a tech company that had just gone through a major rebranding, with a new, more modern name. The second she said it, my brain did that delayed reaction thing. I knew that name. It was my company. We had just spent months and way too much money picking that name. I sat there smiling automatically while my parents did their usual performance. My mother put her hand over her chest and kept saying how proud she was, how this proved that real effort and real education paid off. My father launched into a speech about prestige and stability, and how this was exactly the kind of job a serious person went after. Then he turned to me with that familiar mix of pity and irritation and asked, in front of everyone, what my plan was now that my little experiment clearly was not going anywhere. Before I could answer, he kept going. He talked about how I was still living in their basement at 24, still refusing to finish my degree, still being carried by their generosity. He said he had been patient long enough and that seeing my sister finally succeed made him realize he could not keep enabling my so-called lifestyle. My mother nodded along, dabbing at her eyes, and my sister watched me like she was waiting for a fight to break out. When he said I had until that night to pack my things and get out, it should have broken me. Instead, I felt this almost hysterical little burst of laughter caught in my throat. The whole thing was ridiculous. I already had an apartment. I already had a life outside that house. The only thing they were actually taking from me was the illusion that they were in control of anything, but the words still landed. Being called a parasite by your own father is not something you just shrug off because the logistics technically work out. I did not argue. I finished my food, put my plate in the sink, and said I would be out of their way by the end of the night. My mother tried to spin that into a moral victory, saying maybe being forced to stand on my own would finally make me grow up. And I just nodded because there was no point in explaining that I had been standing on my own for years. I went downstairs, grabbed the sad suitcase and the old laptop I had kept there for show, and walked out without telling them where I was going. The next morning, I got to the office earlier than usual and went straight to human resources. I asked for the list of new hires starting that week, and there it was, my sister's name printed neatly in the middle of the page. For a second, I thought about stepping back, letting it all play out without getting personally involved. That would have been the mature choice, probably. Instead, I told the HR manager I wanted to stop by the orientation session to welcome everyone and talk about company values. By 9 in the morning, the new hires were gathered in one of our bigger conference rooms, sitting around tables with their temporary badges and little notepads. I waited until the HR manager had gone through most of the boring basics, then walked in with my coffee like it was just another day at work. My sister was near the front, facing the big monitor. When she glanced over and saw me, I watched her face go through 3 stages in about 2 seconds. Confusion, amusement, and then mean amusement. "Oh my God," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "You work here too? What, did they finally hire you to clean or something?" People laughed, because of course they did. They did not know me yet. To them, I was just some random woman walking through the room with a coffee. I felt this wave of heat climb up my neck, but I also felt something else. Something cold and steady. I turned to the HR manager and said her name, and she responded immediately, standing up a little straighter, her whole body language shifting in that way people do when their boss walks in. The room went quiet. You could almost hear the mental math happening as people realized there was some dynamic here they had not understood. I took a breath, set my coffee down, and introduced myself the way I usually do when I meet a group like that. "My name is Brielle," I said, "and I am the founder and chief executive officer here." You know that feeling when a room collectively stops breathing? That was it. A couple of the new hires looked down at their hands like they were praying to disappear. One guy swallowed so loudly I could hear it from across the table. My sister just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, like she was trying to reboot. I could have let it go. I could have laughed it off, made some joke about siblings, and moved on. Instead, I reminded everyone in a very calm voice that the company had a zero-tolerance policy for disrespect and harassment, even in joke form, and that we took how people treated each other very seriously. Then I turned toward my sister and said she owed the room an apology. She blinked at me like I had slapped her. For a second, I thought she was going to refuse, and honestly, I don't know what I would have done then. But she stood up on shaky legs, cleared her throat, and muttered something about being out of line and not meaning any harm. Her voice wobbled and her eyes were shiny. And I felt that pinch of guilt that always shows up when you do something on purpose that you know is technically justified, but still feels a little cruel. I stepped back, told the HR manager to continue with the orientation, and asked my sister to stop by my office at the end of the day. Then I walked out like my legs weren't shaking. The second my office door closed behind me, I had to sit down because the adrenaline crash was brutal. I kept thinking, okay, you wanted them to see you, right? Well, now they see you. Congratulations. When my sister showed up that afternoon, she looked like she had aged 10 years in a few hours. Her eyes were puffy. Her hair was falling out of its careful style, and she walked in like someone heading to a sentencing hearing. I gestured for her to sit, opened her file on my screen, and tried to switch my brain into professional mode. I told her straight up that her resume was solid and that she had been hired on her own qualifications, not because anyone knew she was related to me. I also told her that what she said that morning would have been a problem even if she had said it to a random coworker. But saying it to the person who technically owned the building took it from bad judgment to something much closer to self-sabotage. She started crying pretty much immediately, big messy tears, saying she had no idea I was in charge, that she thought I was some kind of temp or assistant. Then she hit me with the question that has been echoing in my head ever since. She asked why I never told them, why I never told her or our parents, or anyone in the family, what I had built. Why I let them keep treating me like some failure living in the basement while I was showing up in magazines. I told her the truth, or at least the version I could fit into that conversation without breaking down. I said our parents had decided who I was a long time ago, and that nothing I said seemed to change it. When I tried to share good news, they would either dismiss it or twist it into some criticism. I said it felt easier to stay quiet than to hand them something I was proud of and watch them tear it apart. I also told her that this job of hers, this opportunity, needed to be about her work, not about whatever story the family had been telling about me for years. I kept her on, because firing her on her first day would have been overkill and frankly a nightmare for HR. But I made it clear that she would be reporting to one of our strictest managers, someone who did not tolerate drama or excuses, and that in the office I was her boss, not her sister. I also told her I was not going to call our parents and walk them through my job title or bank statements. If she wanted them to know, that was her decision and her mess. 2 days later, my parents made the decision for themselves. Apparently, someone from their social circle had seen the article about young tech founders and had put 2 and 2 together after hearing about my sister's new job. They showed up at the office reception without an appointment, full of that fake politeness they use when they're furious but still want to look respectable. My assistant buzzed me, sounding nervous, and I had to take a full minute before I told her to send them back. They walked into my office and did that thing where they look around like they're evaluating a hotel room they might complain about. My father's face was red, my mother's eyes were already watery, and there was this heavy silence before he started in. He accused me of lying to them, of deceiving them, of humiliating them in front of the entire family by letting them talk about me like some lost cause while I was apparently building an empire behind their backs. He said they always believed I had potential and that I had betrayed their trust. I just stared at him for a second, because hearing him rewrite our entire history in real time like that was honestly impressive, in a twisted way. Then I asked him calmly to tell me one time he had ever asked a real question about my work, instead of just assuming it was a joke. I reminded them of all the dinners where any time I opened my mouth they cut me off to brag about my sister. I pointed out that I had been in their house under their roof, working at this thing for years, and they had never once come down to that basement and said, "Hey, show me what you're building." My mother tried to shift things into Hallmark mode at that point. She talked about family, about how we should be happy for each other and share our blessings. She said it hurt her that I would rather have strangers know my business than my own parents. I asked her to name 3 basic things about my life that didn't involve my sister or that basement. She couldn't. She stuttered something about my favorite color, which she got wrong, and my favorite food, which she also got wrong and then just kind of trailed off. My father tried a different tactic, the faux reconciliation speech. He said we should all put this behind us, that we could move forward as a united family now that the truth was out. I told him they had had more than 2 decades to act like a united family, and they chose performance and comparison instead. I said I was not interested in pretending everything was fine just because my title finally made sense to them. I ended the conversation by telling them they were not allowed to show up at my office unannounced again, and that if they wanted to talk to me, they could call first like everyone else. I walked them back to reception myself, which was probably more for me than for them, because I needed to physically see them leave that building. For a few weeks after that, there was nothing but silence. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. I started to think maybe they were actually going to respect the boundary, and part of me was weirdly disappointed, like I had expected at least one dramatic follow-up. When my mother finally showed up again, she came alone, holding a folder the way my sister had held hers that night at dinner. Except this time there was no excitement in her face, just this carefully arranged desperation. She sat down in my office and laid out bank statements, loan documents, and notices that basically said my father's business was falling apart. Bad investments, unpaid bills, a slow decline that they had apparently kept quiet because they didn't want anyone to think they had failed. She said they were on the edge of losing everything, that the only realistic way out was a significant loan, or me opening doors to clients who might save the business. She talked about how my father had worked his whole life and didn't deserve to end it this way. Then she said the line that still makes my teeth clench. Family helps family. I reminded her, maybe a little too calmly, that a few weeks earlier that same family had called me a parasite and kicked me out with an ultimatum, like I was some teenager sneaking out past curfew. I pointed out that my father had had 3 full decades of being the golden parent with the respectable business, the one everyone respected, while I was building something in a basement no one cared about. I told her I was not going to put my company on the line or empty my accounts to bail him out of messes he had created while ignoring me. She shifted from pleading to guilt in under a minute. She said people would talk, that they would say I was cold, that all my money had turned me into someone heartless. She said one day I would regret not helping them. I told her she was absolutely allowed to say whatever she wanted to whoever she wanted, but that I was not going to finance a rewrite of our history just because their story had stopped working for them. After she left, I blocked both of their numbers. I told my assistant that my parents were not to be let into the building again unless I explicitly approved it. It felt harsh, even as I did it, but I also felt this strange sense of relief, like I had finally shut a door that had been banging in the wind for years. Of course, the peace did not last. Over the next couple of months, they lost the business completely and had to sell the house I had grown up in. Instead of taking any responsibility, they did what they always do. They went on a tour of pity. They started telling everyone that their ungrateful daughter had become successful and abandoned them in their old age. They cried in living rooms and at community events, telling this watered-down soap opera version of our life, where my father was a hardworking saint, and my mother was a fragile victim, and I was the villain who slammed the door in their faces. I know this because people started coming to me. Distant relatives messaged me on a social app, asking how I could do that to the people who raised me. An aunt I barely knew left this long voicemail saying she had heard I was living in luxury while my parents were struggling to pay rent, and that she hoped one day my own kids would treat me the way I was treating them so I could understand how it felt. That one actually made me laugh out loud, even as it stung, because the idea of me choosing to have kids with the way things were going felt like a joke. My sister called one night, her voice shaking. She said our parents were really suffering, that they had lost almost everything, that maybe I could help a little, just enough to get them back on their feet. I asked her if she had offered them part of her own paycheck. She went quiet for a long time, then said it was complicated, that she had bills too, that it was not the same. That told me everything I needed to know. The worst part was when all of this started bleeding into my work life. A client mentioned, in a very careful voice, that they had heard some things about tension in my family and wanted to make sure it would not affect our partnership. Apparently, my mother had started joining these local groups and spinning stories about how money had changed me, how success had gone to my head. I could feel something inside me snap that day, something that had been hanging on by a thread for a long time. Meanwhile, at the office, my sister was turning into a walking HR headache. She started dropping it into conversation that she was related to the founder, letting people assume that meant something. When her manager tried to hold her accountable for missed deadlines, she would make these comments about how some people had to work twice as hard because they didn't have the right last name, as if I had ever had a last name that helped me with anything in that house. She started telling coworkers that I had always been jealous of her, that this job was just another example of me trying to control her life. When that story made its way back to me through HR, it hit me harder than I expected. I could handle strangers calling me cruel. I could handle clients giving me side-eye until I explained. But hearing that my own sister was repainting our childhood as if I had been the one in the spotlight, as if I had been the one they favored, felt like someone twisting a knife I had already learned to live with. I had a meeting with her manager and the HR team, and they laid out the pattern, using our relationship as a shield, undermining authority, manipulating people's sympathy. We all knew it could not continue. I transferred her to a role with very clear, repetitive tasks and heavy oversight, as far from anything strategic as possible. I told her, in my office again, that I was doing this to give her a chance to stabilize rather than firing her on the spot, but that if I heard about one more comment using our family dynamic at work, she would be out. She accused me of persecuting her, of using my power to punish her for childhood stuff, and I will not lie, that hurt. I told her the door was literally right there, and she was free to leave if she thought another company would be a better fit. She didn't walk out. she stayed for a while, simmering. Around 4 months after my parents had first come to me with their stack of financial papers, they showed up again, calmer this time, and honestly, that scared me more than the yelling. They said they had started therapy, individually and together. They pulled out little notes from their pockets. Things their therapist had apparently said about patterns, favoritism, and the damage they had done by constantly comparing me to my sister. For the first time in my entire life, I heard my father say the words, "We were wrong. If you are waiting for me to say that everything melted and we all cried and hugged, I am going to disappoint you." I did not melt. I felt this mix of anger and exhaustion, and underneath a small stubborn hope that I hated myself for. They said they wanted a chance to actually get to know me, not the version they had built up in their heads. They wanted to have a relationship with me as an adult, to fix things. I told them I was willing to try something, but on my terms, and that those terms would not be up for negotiation. They could see me twice a month, in a neutral public place like a coffee shop, for exactly 1 hour. Not in my home, not at my office, not in any space that belonged to the life I had built without them. If they were more than a few minutes late, if they asked for money, if they brought up business or tried to guilt me over the past, I would walk away and that would be it. I told them I was not promising forgiveness or closeness or holidays together. I was promising coffee and conversation, and that was all. They agreed. Of course they did. They were desperate. We met for the first of those little visits a week later. It was awkward in a way I had not been prepared for. They did not know what to talk about if they were not lecturing me or listing my sister's accomplishments. We ended up talking about the weather, about random news, about how crowded the coffee shop was. They asked what I liked to do in my free time and seemed genuinely surprised when I answered, as if they were interviewing a stranger. As the months went by, they learned stupid basic things like the fact that I actually hate the food my mother had always cooked for me because she never asked what I liked, or that my favorite kind of music was nothing like what they had assumed. I answered politely, but I kept it surface level. I could feel them wanting more, wanting some big emotional breakthrough, but I was not ready to hand that over just because they had a few sessions with a therapist who finally said out loud what I had known since I was a kid. Around the same time, my sister decided to leave the company. She accepted an offer from a competitor and told her manager it was time to build an identity away from my shadow, which would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so sad. She sent me a stiff email saying she appreciated the opportunity and wished me well. I stared at it for a long time before replying with a simple good luck, because anything more would have been a lie. During one of the coffee shop visits, my parents tried to steer the conversation into deeper water. My mother started talking about regret, about nights she could not sleep because she replayed things she had said to me when I was younger. My father said he knew they had pushed too hard, that they had been unfair. I stopped them. I reminded them of the rule: no digging into the past, no emotional autopsy. If we were going to do that, it needed to be in a therapist's office, not over lattes at a crowded table. They did not like that. My father said that after all the work they had done, all the effort, they deserved more openness from me. That word, deserved, lit me up. I told him gently but very clearly that he did not get to decide what kind of emotional access he deserved to me. I said they were not the ones in charge anymore. I think that might have been the first moment he really understood that the power balance had shifted for good. By the 6th month of those visits, the tension had started to build again. My mother mentioned very casually that they hoped to be involved in future important moments in my life, like if I ever got married or had children. I almost laughed, because the idea of inviting them into those spaces after everything felt like inviting a tornado into a glass house. I told her there were no guarantees, that she needed to stop imagining some big family reunion scenario. My father said they had done the work, that 6 months of therapy and consistent visits should earn them some trust back. I told them 6 months could not erase decades, and that I was not interested in pretending otherwise just to make things smoother for them. When they pushed again, asking if they could at least come see my apartment, I said no. I told them, very plainly, that my home was my safe place, and they were not welcome there. My mother's eyes filled with tears and my father's jaw clenched, and I felt that old familiar guilt rise up. But I did not back down. Apparently that was the moment my mother decided to revert to her favorite coping mechanism: public performance. A few weeks later, someone sent me a screenshot of a long post she had written in a community group on a social app. In it, she talked about her estranged daughter, who refused to let her own parents see where she lived, who punished them for past mistakes even after they had sought help. She painted herself as this tragic figure trying her best with a cold and distant child. She did not use my name, but anyone who knew us would have recognized who she meant. At our next scheduled coffee visit, I showed her the screenshot before I even sat down. My hands were shaking, not from sadness, but from anger so sharp it felt almost clean. I told them the experiment was over. They had broken the bare minimum of trust I had offered by taking our situation back to the court of public opinion like they always did. I said I would not be meeting them like that anymore. They begged. They said it was just a cry for help, that she had written it on a bad night, that she regretted it. I told them I believed they were sorry, but that this was exactly the pattern I had grown up with. Public drama first, private apology second. I said I was done playing my part in that. After that, months went by with no contact at all. The silence was different this time, heavier but also cleaner. I poured myself into work again, the way I always do when my personal life feels like a mess I do not know how to untangle. We expanded the company, opened a small satellite office in a nearby city, hired more people. I built a circle of friends who had never met my family and only knew the version of me that existed outside that house, outside that basement. They saw me as competent, funny, stubborn, generous, messy. They did not see me as the disappointment. About a year after that night, my father told me to get out. I realized I could think about my parents without my whole body tensing up. The anger was still there, but it had cooled into something more solid. Not forgiveness, just clarity. I knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. I knew what they had done and what they had lost. I also knew I did not owe them access to the parts of my life that finally felt like mine. After around 6 months of total silence, I agreed to see them again, but on even stricter terms. Short monthly visits, half an hour at most, same public place. No talk of the past, no talk of money, no talk of other people's opinions. They took what they could get. They showed up, sat across from me, and asked about work in this light, careful way, like they were afraid of stepping on a landmine. They did not push for invitations or more time. Maybe they finally understood the limits were real. Maybe they were just tired. My sister texted me on holidays and birthdays, little polite messages that said things like, "Hope you are well and wishing you the best." We never talked about the company or our parents or that day in the conference room. Sometimes I typed out long replies, paragraphs that I deleted before sending because there was too much to say and no good way to say it. I stopped caring about that somewhere along the way. I moved out of that orbit, physically and emotionally. I built a life in a different part of the city with people who don't know me as the difficult daughter or the weird girl in the basement. When I walk into my apartment now, I close the door behind me and there is no one upstairs comparing me to anyone else. No one waiting to turn my victories into someone else's spotlight. It is not a perfect happy ending. There is no big family hug, no holiday miracle where everyone suddenly learns how to love each other the right way. What I got instead was something smaller, but honestly, more real. I got distance. I got the right to decide who gets to know me and how much. I got to stop auditioning for a role I never wanted. If you are listening to this and waiting for some moral or neat conclusion, I don't really have one. All I can say is that sometimes the best you can do with the family you were given is stop letting them write your story. Mine will always include a basement, 1,000 comparisons I never asked for, and the sound of my father's voice telling me to get out. It will also include the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when he slammed that door, he had no idea I was already gone, building something they could no longer control, whether they ever chose to see it or not. The aftermath was not neat or cinematic. I went to therapy, learned to catch myself mid-spiral, and slowly built a life with people who knew me as competent and funny instead of the family disappointment. Some days I still heard my father's dismissive tone in my own voice during meetings, and had to consciously choose not to recreate his patterns at work. I made it a rule to never use comparison as a weapon, to keep hard conversations behind closed doors, and to actually ask people who they were instead of deciding for them. My parents settled into a smaller rental apartment, and into this strange role of distant relatives I happened to share a lot of history with. We saw each other briefly in coffee shops now and then. They asked careful questions, tried not to push, and occasionally slipped back into old habits before catching themselves. The community we grew up in still sees me as the villain in their version, the ungrateful daughter who got money and lost her heart. I stopped trying to fix that storyline. Let them keep the play they rehearsed for decades. I am not in that audience anymore. If there is anything close to a lesson here, it is just this. You can love your parents and still decide they do not get full access to you. You can grow up being told you are less and still build a life where you are not the punchline. When my father told me to get out, he had no idea I was already halfway gone. Out of his house, out of the role they wrote for me, and into a life they cannot control, whether they ever choose to really see it or not. Every once in a while now, I will get an update about my parents through my sister in those polite holiday texts. A small health scare, a neighbor moving away, a new hobby they are trying. I listen. I respond with neutral concern, and then I go back to whatever I was doing before. I do not rush to their side. I do not ignore it completely either. I exist in that middle space, the one no one writes stories about, where you care enough to hope they are okay, but not enough to let them pull you back into the old roles. Maybe that is the real ending here, as unsatisfying as it might sound. Not total estrangement, not cozy reconciliation, just a complicated, imperfect distance where everyone knows the lines they are not supposed to cross anymore. They stay mostly on their side. I stay on mine. Sometimes our paths overlap for a coffee or a text or a random event. Most days they do not. And in the middle of all that, life keeps happening. The company grows or stalls or shifts direction. New people join, others leave. I screw things up, fix them, screw up different things. I learn, slowly, how to be a boss who does not weaponize comparison, who does not use silence as punishment, who does not mistake fear for respect. I fail at that sometimes and then try again. I make time for friends who feel more like family than the people who share my genetics. I figure out what I actually like to eat when I am not trying to anticipate someone else's reaction. If you stripped away the career part, the business and the panels and all of that, the core of my story would still be the same. It is about a girl who grew up being told she was never enough and then built a life where she stopped asking the same people who broke her to be the ones to fix her. It is about messy boundaries and late-night panic and blocked numbers and tiny victories that no one claps for except you and maybe one or two people who really get it. So if you are waiting for me to say that one day my parents woke up completely transformed, sorry. They are better in some ways, still themselves in others. They forget and slip back into old habits sometimes. I catch it now, name it, and step back before it swallows me. That, more than anything, is the change that matters. Not their tears, not their apologies, not their failed businesses or rented apartments. My reaction? I used to think being a good daughter meant absorbing every blow and still showing up smiling. Now, my definition is different. Being a good daughter, for me, means not teaching the next version of me. Whether that is a niece or some kid in a coding class or whoever, that love equals constant self-betrayal. It means letting the story be complicated and ugly and not cleaned up for public viewing, even if that makes some people uncomfortable. So when I tell you all this, it is not because I want you to pick a side or tell me I did the right thing. I am not on trial. I am just finally saying the quiet part out loud, the part my parents have edited out of their version for years. They still have their story. This one is mine. And for the first time, that feels like enough. The weeks right after everything blew up with my parents and my sister were weird in a way I did not know how to explain to anyone who had not grown up like that. At work, people were still figuring out how to be around me now that they knew their boss was the same woman who used to show up in old sneakers and sit quietly in the back of the room during all hands. I could feel it when I walked down the hall, this mix of respect and curiosity and a little bit of fear, which was honestly hilarious considering I still went home and ate cereal for dinner over the sink some nights because I was too tired to cook. One morning, I walked past the break room and heard my sister's name followed by that little drop in volume people do when they know they are talking about something they should not be talking about. I caught a fragment of one of the new analysts saying he felt bad for her, that it must be hard to have a sibling as your boss, and another voice, older, saying quietly that it was only hard if you tried to act like the rules did not apply to you. I stood there with my hand on the door frame, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of a spoon against a mug, and I had this split second where I almost walked in and made some big speech about professionalism and respecting everyone. Instead, I backed away and went to my office. I did not need to control the narrative in every room anymore. I just needed the work to speak for itself. Human Resources scheduled a check-in with me a few days after I moved my sister under that stricter manager. They sent one of the senior people, the kind who has the calm voice and the stack of printed policies. She asked if I wanted to file any kind of formal complaint about my sister's comments during orientation or the things she had been saying to coworkers. The company would support me if I did, she said. I sat there looking at the logo on the folder between us and realized how bizarre it was that for the first time in my life, the system was tilted in my favor. I could have made things very ugly for my sister very fast. I told her I did not want some big public punishment, that I just needed my sister to be held to the same standards as everyone else. I said if the performance did not match the expectations, then the consequences should be the same as they would be for any other employee. The woman from Human Resources nodded like she actually believed me, like she understood that this was not about revenge. Inside, I was a mess. Part of me wanted to watch my sister get marched out of the building with a box of her things, just so I could send that image back in time to the version of me sitting in the basement while everyone clapped for her at dinner. Another part of me, the part that had learned how much it cost to live in that kind of drama, knew that keeping things boring and professional was the only way I was going to survive all of this, without turning into a different version of my parents. The first coffee with my parents under all those new rules felt like the most awkward job interview I have ever sat through, and I have sat through some painful ones. We met in this generic little place near my office, the kind with beige walls and fake plants where no one is trying to impress anyone. I picked it on purpose because there were no memories attached to it. No birthday cakes, no graduation photos, no holiday decorations that would make my mother tear up and try to turn the conversation into some kind of nostalgic hostage situation. They were already there when I arrived, sitting side by side instead of across from each other, which told me everything I needed to know about how they had been psyching themselves up for this. My father had his hands folded on the table, fingers laced so tightly his knuckles were white. My mother had one of those paper cups in front of her, untouched, her lipstick printed perfect on the lid from where she had tested it once and then forgotten about it. For the first 10 minutes, we talked about absolutely nothing. The weather, traffic, a construction project near their new place. It sounded like small talk between strangers who happened to share a language, not people who had raised me. My mother kept glancing at my hands the way she always did when she was nervous, like she expected to see ink stains or chipped nail polish she could comment on. My father asked if work was keeping me busy, in that tone that pretends to be polite but is really just fishing for something to criticize. I told him yes, that running a company took up most of my time, and he nodded like he was talking to someone describing a hobby. At one point, my mother asked if I was still living in that little place, and I told her I had moved to a bigger apartment a while ago. She smiled too wide and said that was nice, and then immediately changed the subject to a neighbor's retirement party. It was like watching them walk right up to a door that said, "This is who your daughter is now," and then turn around on purpose. Eventually, my father cleared his throat and said they were trying to do better. He did not use words like abusive or cruel or controlling. He said they had been too hard on me, that they maybe had not understood what I was doing with my life. My mother nodded along, eyes already shiny, and added that watching my sister struggle at work after everything that happened had made her realize they had not done any of us favors by dividing us into the successful one and the difficult one. I wanted to ask her where that insight had been when I was 13 and crying in the basement over a math quiz she did not even remember existed. Instead, I took a sip of my coffee and told them I appreciated the effort. It was not forgiveness. It was just acknowledgement that they were at least looking in the right direction now. Therapy during that stretch of time was not some dramatic breakthrough where I yelled into pillows and walked out feeling cured. It was more like having someone slowly tilt a mirror I had been staring into my whole life, showing me angles I had never realized were there. My therapist asked questions that sounded almost stupid at first. Like, what did I think a normal reaction from a parent would have been when I announced I wanted to start a company? Or how did I imagine a different mother might have responded to that first interview about the business? I kept wanting to say they would have done exactly what mine did, because for so long that was all I knew. One day she had me walk through, step by step, the night my father threw me out. Where I was standing, what he said, what my mother did, what my body felt like. I told her how my ears rang and my hands went numb, and how I still packed my things neatly because some part of me was sure that if I looked messy, they would use that as proof I was irresponsible. She looked at me for a long time after I finished talking and said, very quietly, that none of that sounded like a disagreement or a rough patch. It sounded like a trauma response. I laughed at first because the word felt way too big for something that had happened in a dining room in a regular house in a regular suburb. Then I realized my throat hurt and my eyes were burning, and I was gripping the arm of the couch so hard my fingers ached. It was the first time I let myself consider that maybe the problem had never been that I was too sensitive. I told her that my parents loved me, because that was the line I had been repeating my whole life whenever something felt off. She did not argue with that. She just asked what I meant by love in practice, not in theory. Did they show up for me? Did they ask questions and listen to the answers? Did they ever apologize without turning it into a speech about how hard their own childhoods had been? I sat there picking at a loose thread on the cushion and realized I could not come up with many examples that did not end with me feeling smaller than when the conversation started. It was weirdly harder to say that out loud than it had been to talk about being thrown out of the house. Admitting that the foundation was cracked felt more dangerous than describing the moment the wall actually collapsed. Maybe the problem was that I had been taught to call things normal that were not remotely normal. Every time my parents found a new way to present themselves as victims to the community, some version of that old shame would flare up. I would get a screenshot from a cousin or a forwarded message from someone I had not talked to since high school saying they were praying for my parents in this difficult time and that they hoped I would remember that family is everything. I wrote at least 3 long replies that I never sent, explaining in exhausting detail what had actually happened, listing specific examples, naming dates and times and quotes like I was building a court case. In the end, I always deleted them. I started to understand that anyone who heard our daughter abandoned us when we lost everything and did not think to ask a single follow-up question was not my audience. Holidays were the strangest adjustment. There was one year, not long after my parents had moved into the smaller apartment, when my sister texted a group message asking what everyone was doing for one particular winter holiday. I was sitting on my couch with takeout containers on the coffee table, laptop open to a spreadsheet because apparently that is my version of comfort. For the first time ever, I realized I had the option of not going, not making the drive, not walking into a room where every story started with, "Remember when you embarrassed us," and ended with my sister being praised for something. I said I already had plans. It was technically true. My plans were to stay home, bake something from a boxed mix, and watch whatever random movie I could find while texting a friend who was also avoiding their family for reasons of their own. It was easily one of the calmest holidays I have ever had. No one slammed a door. No one made a joke with my life as the punchline. No one asked for money. I baked cookies from a box mix and they came out a little too flat, but they made the apartment smell like something out of a memory that never actually existed in my real childhood. I put on a movie I had already seen 3 times so I would not have to pay full attention, and I let myself answer messages from friends slowly instead of sprinting to reply between chores. At one point, I caught myself humming along to some cheesy song from a commercial and had this ridiculous thought that maybe this is what holidays are supposed to feel like when you are not walking on eggshells. Boring, a little lonely, but safe. I could work with boring and safe. The last real conversation I had with my sister before she left the company happened in the parking lot on a random weekday evening. The sun was already down, the kind of early darkness that makes you feel like the day has been stolen from you. She was leaning against her car, arms folded, staring at the ground like it had personally offended her. I almost walked past her because I was so tired I could feel the exhaustion buzzing under my skin, but she looked up and said my name in a way that made it clear she had been waiting. She told me she had accepted an offer somewhere else, that she knew I probably already knew through some email or paperwork, but wanted to say it out loud. She kicked at a little pile of gravel with the toe of her shoe and said she had spent most of her time there waiting for me to suddenly turn into the version of me our parents always described, the one who was lazy and dramatic and irresponsible. Instead, she kept running into this other person, the one who stayed late to help a team finish a deadline and remembered birthdays and knew the name of the receptionist's dog. She said it messed with her head to realize there were whole parts of my life our parents had never bothered to mention, like the fact that my company even existed. I did not know what to do with that information. There was a small, petty part of me that wanted to say, "You could have asked," but I swallowed it. She said she had thought getting hired at my company was going to prove something, that it would finally make her feel as impressive as everyone had always told her she was. Instead, it had felt like being measured against a version of me she had never bothered to get to know. I did not say anything for a minute because I honestly did not trust my mouth. There was too much history sitting between us in that parking lot, too many years of dinners and comments and eye rolls for a tidy conclusion. Eventually, I told her I hoped she found a place where she could figure out who she was without our parents' script running in the background. I said I did not hate her, even if there were days when I wanted to. I did not forgive her either, not fully, but I was not interested in spending the rest of my life as the mirror image of the people who had hurt me. She nodded, wiped at her face like she could not quite believe she was crying, and said that maybe we could be the kind of siblings who send each other messages on holidays and birthdays and leave it at that. I said that sounded about right. We have mostly kept that bargain. By the time all of this settled into something like a new normal, my life from the outside probably looked pretty boring. Coworkers who met me years later only saw the version of me who double-checked calendar invites and brought extra pens to meetings. Neighbors knew me as the woman who always carried all the grocery bags in one trip and waved politely in the hallway. That was kind of the point. The chaos that used to live in every room of my life got downgraded to background noise I could mute when I needed to. When people complained about their parents being a little overbearing, I learned to nod and say, "Yeah, I get it," without feeling the need to hand them my entire history like a file. That is what I wanted. The drama stayed contained in specific places instead of bleeding into every room. Fights had beginnings and endings instead of stretching on for weeks in passive-aggressive silence. If my phone lit up with a family name, I could choose not to pick up, and the world did not end. It is not a perfect story. There is no neat bow that makes all of it worth it. But there is space now between who they decided I was and who I actually am, and I finally get to live in that space instead of constantly trying to earn it.